Nobody had looked at this photograph in over 100 years, and something mysterious was hanging above the door that the experts almost missed. When they finally zoomed in, the colour drained from their faces. What they uncovered behind that image was one of the darkest human stories ever hidden inside a single frame. That should not be in a family photograph. Grant said it quietly, almost to himself. Nora looked up from the photograph she was cataloguing and crossed the room to where he was sitting. She leaned in and looked at what was on his screen and did not say anything for a moment. It had started as the most routine morning of their year. A retired surveyor from Hillsborough had donated his life's collection to the University of Oregon archives when he retired. Old maps, field notes, and a box of pioneer-era photographs that nobody had opened in years. Grant and Nora had been working through them methodically all morning, pulling each one out, logging it carefully and moving to the next. Cabin shots, farmland, families standing stiff and unsmiling outside their homes. Nothing that gave either of them any reason to slow down. Until Grant pulled out that particular photograph and everything about that morning changed. 7 people were posed in front of a log cabin with a sod roof. 2 armed men stood at either end of the group and anchored the edges like they were standing guard over something. 3 women sat in the centre, while a man stood directly behind them with his hands at his sides and his face completely unreadable. Pressed into the group was a very young girl who was small enough that she almost disappeared into the frame. Something about her position unsettled Grant in a way he could not immediately name. She was not standing with the women in the centre, the way a child naturally gravitates toward family. She was positioned slightly apart from them, close to the edge of the group, as though she had been placed there rather than chosen to stand there herself. Grant studied it quietly, and then called Nora over without saying why. She leaned in and looked at it for a moment, but nothing immediately struck her as unusual. It appeared to be a pioneer family standing outside their home, formal and stiff like all the others they had seen that morning. Then Grant pointed to the top of the image just above the cabin door, right where a family might nail a horseshoe or hang a small wooden cross. There was something else hanging there instead, and it did not belong in a family portrait. Nora leaned closer while Grant zoomed in slowly. It was an animal, small and limp, and it was hanging upside down by its feet directly above the doorframe. It looked like a rabbit, and it had been placed there deliberately because nothing about its position suggested it had simply fallen or been left by accident. Nora's expression changed the moment she realised what she was looking at. The colour drained from her face slowly, the way it does when something registers not just as strange but as deeply wrong. Grant was not much better. He sat back from the screen and said nothing for a long moment because there was nothing immediately logical to say. People did not gather their entire family, invite a photographer all the way out to a remote cabin, and then hang a dead animal above their front door for the portrait unless that animal carried a very specific meaning to them. Grant looked at the little girl who was standing in the frame, and he noticed that the rabbit was hanging directly above her head. Nora straightened up slowly and told him to mark it for enhancement. They placed the photograph to one side and continued working through the rest of the box, but neither of them said very much after that. 10 minutes later, Grant's hand touched something at the very bottom of the box. It was a second envelope that had been tucked so deep it was almost hidden beneath everything else. He lifted it out carefully and opened it slowly. He called Nora over immediately. What was inside made them both go completely still. The second envelope contained a single photograph, and it stopped Grant cold the moment he pulled it out. It was identical to the first image in almost every way. The cabin and its sod roof had not changed. Both armed men were standing at either end of the group in exactly the same positions they had held before. 3 women remained seated in the centre, while the unreadable man still stood behind them with his hands at his sides. That little girl was still pressed toward the edge of the group, and the lighting fell across the front of the cabin at exactly the same angle as before. Grant laid both photographs side by side on the lab table, and he and Nora leaned over them together. At first glance they looked like duplicates, but they were not duplicates because one person was missing from the second photograph. The woman who had been seated on the ground to the right of the group was completely gone. No blur, no shadow, no trace of her at all. The rest of the group had not moved a single inch, but she had vanished entirely as though she had never been there. And there was something else. The thing hanging above the door had changed. It was darker in the second photograph and its angle was slightly different, as though someone had adjusted it or replaced it between one photograph and the next. Grant checked the timestamps on both images. They had been taken within 25 minutes of each other. 25 minutes. That was all the time that had passed between a woman being present and a woman being erased. Nora straightened up and looked at Grant. Nobody retakes a formal family portrait on a remote ridge within 25 minutes, unless something has gone very wrong between one photograph and the next. And nobody removes a single person from a group image that precisely and that completely by accident. Someone had made a deliberate decision that this woman should not exist in the historical record of this family. They just did not yet know who she was or what she had done to deserve that erasure. Grant turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded ink were the words, "Ward Family, June 1878, Flat Creek Ridge." He started pulling records that same afternoon, and what he found about the Ward family and the world they lived in made that erasure feel far more calculated than either of them had been prepared for. The name on the back of the photograph was all they had to start with, but it was enough. Grant spent the rest of that day pulling every record he could find on the Ward family. Census documents, land filings, church registers. What those records revealed was a picture of a man named Silas Ward who had built himself a life on Flat Creek Ridge at a time when that part of Oregon had no courthouse, no sheriff, and no governing authority of any kind. There was no law out there. There were only men with land and the reputations they managed carefully enough to keep it. Silas Ward had both. His land claim was substantial, and his standing among the church elders and neighbouring landowners of the area appeared solid. But that kind of standing was fragile in ways that people today would find difficult to understand. A single moral scandal in a community like that could unravel everything a man had spent years building. His wife's family connections could be severed. His land claim could be contested. His reputation, which was essentially his only legal protection in unincorporated territory, could be destroyed completely and permanently. Grant understood now why someone might go to extreme lengths to control what the historical record said about their family. Among the land documents was a formal inspection notice scheduling a government assessment across Flat Creek Ridge for late summer of 1878. Grant logged it as routine historical administration and set it aside. At that moment it seemed like background detail and nothing more. Then he found something that made him go very still. At the bottom of a census record from 1876, there was a woman's name listed under the Ward household, not as wife, sister or relative, not as family in any capacity. There was just a single word written beside her name to describe her place in that home. The word was domestic. Her name was Sarah. No wages were recorded beside her name. No family was listed. No origin was noted anywhere in the document. Women like Sarah in 1878 did not usually choose domestic service on a remote ridge in unincorporated Oregon Territory. They arrived there because life had already taken everything else from them. A dead father, a collapsed family, debt that had no other resolution. They came with nothing, and they signed themselves into a household that was not their home, under a man who was not their family, in a place where no law existed to protect them from whatever that man decided to do. Sarah had come from nowhere and she belonged to no one. And that single word beside her name told Grant and Nora exactly how much power she held in that household, which was none at all. That single fact sent Grant deeper into the records that same night. If Sarah had been living under Silas Ward's roof since at least 1876, then there had to be more. More documents, more entries, more traces of a woman that someone had worked very hard to keep invisible. He searched through county registers, household filings, and every local record connected to Flat Creek Ridge until he found what he had not known he was looking for. It was a birth record, a single entry in a county register from 1874. A girl had been born at the Ward household on Flat Creek Ridge. Under the column for the mother's name was one word, Sarah. Under the column for the father's name was nothing at all. The space had been left completely blank, and in 1878 a blank space in that column was not an oversight. It was a decision. Someone had chosen not to write that name down, and the only reason a man left his name off a birth record was because putting it there would cost him something he was not willing to lose. Grant called Nora in and placed the record in front of her without saying a word. Nora looked at the record and then looked at Grant, and neither of them needed to say it out loud because they were both already thinking it. They pulled up both photographs side by side and looked at them again with this new knowledge sitting heavily between them, and what they saw this time stopped them both completely. The little girl in the photograph was not standing with the Ward family. She was pressed close to the woman who had been erased from the second photograph, the woman with no wages, origin, and no power in that household. That little girl had been standing with her mother the entire time. Sarah was not simply a domestic servant who had wandered into the frame of a family portrait. She was the mother of a child that Silas Ward had fathered and could never once acknowledge in public. Because acknowledgement meant confession. It meant admitting that he had fathered a child with a woman who lived entirely under his authority, a woman who had no voice and no recourse and no ability to refuse him anything. It meant his wife's family withdrawing every connection and resource that held his land claim together. It meant the church elders of that community, who governed moral life on that ridge with absolute authority, turning their backs on him permanently. It meant the complete destruction of everything he had spent years constructing. His land, his standing, his name, his future. That little girl was not just a child. She was the living proof of what Silas Ward had done. And the birth record told them her name. Her name was Ruth. Grant and Nora knew if Sarah had refused to stay quiet about any of it, if she'd refused to pretend that Ruth did not exist and disappear into the background of that household, then that refusal would have made her the single greatest threat to everything Silas Ward had built. And everything about the evidence in front of them suggested that was exactly what had happened. So on a June morning in 1878, a photographer hauled his camera and equipment all the way up to Flat Creek Ridge. And what happened in the time that photographer was present tells you exactly how desperate and calculated Silas Ward truly was. Because those two photographs were not taken minutes apart by accident. They were taken minutes apart by design. Grant reached back into the folder and pulled out the land inspection notice he had logged and set aside 2 days earlier without giving it much thought. It was a formal government document scheduling a land assessment across Flat Creek Ridge for late summer of 1878. Unincorporated Oregon Territory was being reviewed for county integration, and every landowner in that area needed to demonstrate proof of a settled, respectable, and morally sound household, or risk losing everything they had claimed. Grant placed the notice beside the two photographs and looked at the dates. The inspection was scheduled for August 1878. The photographs were taken in June 1878. Silas Ward had hired that photographer exactly 6 weeks before land agents were due to arrive on his ridge. He was not documenting his family. He was building his defense. Nora and Grant immediately understood what was at play. Silas had needed that portrait desperately, and Sarah had known it. She had understood exactly what those photographs were for, and she had sat herself down in that frame deliberately with Ruth, pressed close beside her. It was the most powerful move available to a woman with no legal voice and no other weapon. She was not going to let Silas Ward submit a portrait of a respectable family to land agents, while she and Ruth remained invisible. If he wanted that photograph, he was going to have to deal with her being in it, and Silas Ward had 25 minutes to decide what to do about that. The photographs alone could not tell them what those 25 minutes looked like, but Grant believed the original image, the one Silas had tried to replace, still had something left to give. He pulled it up on the screen and ran the digital enhancement software on it, hoping the technology could reach into that image and pull out details that the naked eye had been missing for over 100 years. The program worked slowly, processing the image in passes, clearing the grain layer by layer until the details of the cabin began to sharpen. The sod roof, the timber frame of the doorway, the beam above the door where the rabbit hung. Grant leaned forward. There was something on that beam that the naked eye had not been able to see. The software continued clearing the image, and the marks on the wood became lines, and the lines became letters, and the letters became words. Grant stopped breathing somewhere in the middle of reading them. 3 words, carved directly into the beam above the door. Ruth, forgive me. Nora put her hand over her mouth. Grant sat back slowly in his chair. Neither of them said anything for a long time because those 3 words had just rewritten everything they thought they understood about Silas Ward and what had happened on that ridge in June of 1878. Because the carving was in the first photograph, not the second, which meant Silas Ward had taken a chisel to that beam and carved his confession into the wood before the second photograph was ever taken. Before Sarah was removed from the property, and before he stood his family back in front of that camera and documented the lie he intended to submit to land agents. He had written Ruth, forgive me first, and then he had done it anyway. Grant pulled up both photographs side by side one more time and looked at the beam in the second image. The carving was gone, covered deliberately. Silas had not only removed Sarah from the frame, he had covered his own confession before the shutter opened a second time. Every trace of what he had done and what he felt about doing it was buried in the space of 25 minutes. But there was something else now that sat heavily in the room between Grant and Nora, something the photographs and the land records and the birth certificate could not answer. The cabin at Flat Creek Ridge still existed. Grant had seen it in the records, and if Silas Ward had gone to the lengths of carving a confession into a beam and then covering it before a photograph was taken, there was every reason to believe that cabin held something more than memories. Grant knew they needed to find that cabin. He tracked down a local Hillsborough historian named August Hale, whose family had owned land near Flat Creek Ridge for generations, and when Grant mentioned the Ward cabin by name, August went quiet on the other end of the line before telling him that the cabin was still standing and that he would take them there himself. He also told Grant that he had something to bring along that he believed they needed to see, but he did not say what it was. When they arrived the following week, the cabin was truly still there. Grant had half expected it to be gone, swallowed up by a century of Oregon wilderness. But as August Hale led them through the tree line and into the clearing at Flat Creek Ridge, there it was. What remained of it leaned heavily to one side as though it had spent decades trying to lie down and never quite managed it. The sod roof had collapsed inward, and vines had wrapped themselves so tightly around the front wall that the wood beneath had almost disappeared entirely. But the doorframe was still standing, intact, solid, as though it had refused to give up the way everything around it had. Grant walked toward the doorframe first. He climbed onto a flat piece of stone beside the entrance and raised himself level with the beam above the door. What he saw made him reach out slowly and press his fingers against the wood. There was a rusted nail driven into the beam, old and thick, the kind used to bear significant weight over a long period of time. Around it the wood was darker than the rest of the beam, stained in a pattern that spread outward from the nail in both directions. Something had hung from that nail for years, long enough to darken the grain of the wood permanently. It was exactly where the rabbit had hung in the photograph. Nora stood below him and looked up at the stain. She had been quiet since they entered the clearing, but now she spoke. She told Grant that in pioneer-era communities across the Oregon Territory, hanging an animal above a door was not always about hunting or food. For families with children of uncertain origins, children who could not be formally claimed or legally documented, the practice carried a different meaning entirely. It was a protection ritual, a public declaration made without words that said this child belongs under this roof. It warned the community not to question the child's presence and not to interfere with her place in that household. It was the only claim a man like Silas could make over a child he could not put his name to in any document. Grant looked at the nail and said nothing for a moment. Then August Hale spoke from behind them both. He had been standing at the edge of the clearing since they arrived, watching them with an expression that suggested he had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and was finally close to being able to put it down. He told them that when Grant had called him about the Ward cabin, something had stirred in his memory. His grandfather had spoken about the Ward place when August was a boy, always in a lowered voice and never with much detail, and had left him a small collection of items connected to the history of Flat Creek Ridge. August had gone through that collection the night before their visit, and found an old photograph tucked between two folded documents at the very bottom of the box. It showed the Ward cabin, still standing but weathered, taken sometime in the early 20th century. He reached into his bag, produced it, and turned it over carefully before holding it out toward Nora. On the back, written in faded but legible ink, was a single line in handwriting that neither Grant nor Nora recognized. It read, "The rabbit must stay up until Ruth's 12th. Nora read it twice. Then she looked at Grant and said quietly that Silas Ward had not hung that rabbit out of folklore alone. He had written it down as an instruction. He had assigned it a specific end date tied directly to Ruth's age, which meant he had planned it deliberately from the beginning. The rabbit was not a ritual he had reached for in a moment of guilt or fear. It was a calculated act of protection for a child he had brought into the world and could never publicly acknowledge, and he had intended it to stand above that door for as long as Ruth remained too young and too vulnerable to protect herself. Grant stepped down from the stone and looked at the beam for a long moment. Then he looked at Nora. They had both been thinking the same thing since they arrived at that clearing, and neither of them had said it out loud yet. If Silas Ward had gone to the lengths of carving a confession into that beam and covering it before a second photograph was taken, and if he had planned the rabbit with enough intention to write down instructions about it, then there was every reason to believe he had left something else behind in that cabin. Something more than memories and stained wood and a rusted nail. They went back the following day with tools. The beam above the door was hollow. It took them less than 20 minutes to find the hidden compartment, and less than a minute after that to ease out what was inside it. A small rusted tin, cold and light, sealed with a scrap of knotted cloth. Grant held it with both hands the entire drive back to the university and did not set it down once. When they finally placed it on the lab table and cut the knotted cloth open, two things were inside: a folded handwritten note and a metal photograph plate that was face down in the tin, as though whoever had sealed it there could not bear to look at it anymore. Grant unfolded the handwritten note and read it aloud. Her eyes were still open when it was done. I have seen them every night since. The ground near the east tree holds what I cannot say out loud, not even here. Ruth must never know what this earth is keeping. God forgive me. The room was completely silent when he finished reading. Silas Ward had sealed that note inside a beam above his door sometime before he disappeared from every record in 1880. He had walked away from that cabin, from Ruth, and from everything he had done, and he had never come back. But he had left that note behind. Whether it was guilt or cowardice or some last desperate need to be understood by someone, he had left it there. And the person he had addressed it to was Ruth. A child he had failed in every way that mattered had been the only person he felt he owed the truth to. Later that week, Grant and Nora went looking for Ruth. They searched through every county record, census entry, and household filing connected to Flat Creek Ridge and the surrounding area between 1880 and 1887. What they found was close to nothing. A child named Ruth appeared once in a census record from 1883, listed under a neighbouring family's roof, not adopted, not acknowledged as family. Just two words beside her name that made Nora close her eyes when she read them: residing with. That was all Ruth was to anyone who wrote her down during those years. A child passed quietly between households, like something nobody wanted to claim, but nobody was willing to completely abandon either. No legal protection, no guardian named, no authority responsible for her welfare. She was 5 years old when Silas left, and the world simply absorbed her into its silence and moved on. But it was what Grant found next that stopped them both cold. An intake record from the Quaker Run Care Centre, where Ruth was admitted in 1888 at 13 years old, contained two notations that no one had ever followed up on or investigated. The first noted visible scarring across both of Ruth's wrists. The marks were described clinically and without elaboration. What caused them, and when they had been made, was not recorded. But the admitting physician noted in the margin that they still looked recent. The second notation recorded that Ruth did not speak a single word during her entire first year at the facility. Not one word to anyone. Tucked into the margin of her file in different handwriting was a single line added later by the nurse who had eventually gained Ruth's trust after months of patient silence. It read, "She speaks now, but will not say where she was or what was done to her during those years. I have stopped asking." Grant read that line twice and set the file down. 8 years. From age 5 to 13, Ruth had existed in a space that no record fully accounted for. And the only evidence of what that space had contained was written in the scars on her wrists and the year of silence she carried into that care home, and the decision of a nurse who had heard enough to know she should never ask again. Whatever had been done to Ruth during those 8 years had been done deliberately, and by someone who understood exactly how to keep a child from being able to tell anyone what she knew. Because Ruth knew something. She had always known something. She was 4 years old when her mother disappeared on a June afternoon, and 5 years old when her father sealed his confession in a beam and seemingly fled. She'd grown up on that ground. She had walked past the East Tree every day of her childhood before Silas left. And someone, somewhere in those 8 silent years, had decided that what Ruth knew needed to stay buried along with everything else on that ridge. But they had underestimated her. Because in 1887, Ruth came back to that cabin, alone. And what she left behind tells you that whatever had been done to her in those 8 years had not broken her. It had made her into something those people should have been far more afraid of. And to find out whatever that was, The team had to revisit the tin they had picked up at the cabin. When they returned to the lab table for the tin, Silas Ward's confession note was still lying open on the table in front of them. Grant then reached back into the tin and lifted out the photograph plate they had set aside when the note had stopped them cold. He held it under the light carefully and then went very still. Nora leaned in, and then she turned away from the table. It showed a girl of about 12 standing alone in the doorway of the Ward cabin. She was small and straight and had the saddest eyes Nora and Grant had ever seen on a child. Her hand rested on the doorbeam beside her, and above the door where the rabbit had hung for 8 years, there was something else nailed in its place. A pair of small children's shoes hanging upside down by their laces from a nail driven into the beam. Her shoes. Grant immediately turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting that was careful and deliberate for a 12-year-old, was a date and 5 words, 1887. I opened it. I know. The room was completely silent. Nora and Grant knew exactly what she was referring to. She had found the beam. She had felt along that wood in the dark the way you only can when you have grown up inside a place and memorized every hollow of it with your hands. She had opened it. She had read what her father wrote. She had read about her mother's eyes still open when it was done. She had read about the East Tree and what the ground near it was keeping. And then she had taken the only thing she owned in the world, and she had nailed it above that door where her father's rabbit used to hang. In 1878, a poor child on a remote Oregon ridge owned 1 pair of shoes if she was lucky. 1 pair, that was all. Ruth had taken hers off her feet and left them there on that beam, and walked away from that ground barefoot. Because leaving her shoes meant leaving everything that place had taken from her. Her mother, her father, her childhood. 8 years of being passed between households like something nobody wanted to name. Whatever her father's rabbit had meant when he hung it there, protection, guilt, a claim he was too cowardly to make in daylight. Ruth's shoes meant something different entirely. They meant she was done. They meant she had come back, read the truth, understood every word of it, and chosen to leave it all there on that ridge where it belonged. She was not carrying her father's guilt any further. She was not carrying the weight of her mother's fate any further. She was walking away from Flat Creek Ridge with bare feet and whatever was left of herself, and she was not looking back. She had nailed those shoes above that door and walked away from Flat Creek Ridge with the full intention of leaving everything on that ground behind her. But the intake record from the Quaker Run Care Centre told a different story. In 1888, 1 year after Ruth stood in that doorway at 12 years old, she arrived at that care home at 13 with fresh scars across both wrists that the admitting physician noted still looked recent. Someone had held her against her will in the year between that cabin and that door. Someone who had perhaps discovered she'd gone back to that cabin. Someone who knew what was sealed in that beam and could not afford for a 13-year-old girl to start talking about what she had read there. Who that was and what they did to her in that year has never been established. The records do not say. Ruth never said. A child who had found the courage to return to the most terrifying place of her life and leave her mark on it, arrived at that care home without a single word left in her. Whatever she had hoped to leave behind on that beam had followed her off that ridge and finished what it started. With desperation coursing through their veins, Nora and Grant later searched for the photographer. They went through every record they could find, every travelling photographer operating in Oregon Territory in 1887, every studio within a day's journey of Flat Creek Ridge. They found nothing. No record of who had stood on that ridge with a camera and documented a 12-year-old girl standing alone in a doorway with her shoes nailed above her head. Nora sat back and said it quietly. She found a way. That is all we know. She found a way to tell her story. Ruth walked away from Flat Creek Ridge in 1887 with bare feet and whatever was left of herself. 1 year later, something had broken the last of what she was carrying and delivered her to a care home door at 13 years old. What happened in those 12 months between that doorway and that institution is the one question this story cannot answer. Because Ruth never said. Not to the nurse who sat with her through a year of silence. Not to anyone who ever knew her after. She had left everything she could bear to leave in that beam. The rest she kept. And she took it with her to her grave.